Okay, now we're going to turn to a Ludwig you probably have heard of. That is the great Ludwig van Beethoven. This is a very early work that Beethoven wrote in 1798, his Opus 11. He actually did not write it for this combination of instruments. He wrote it for clarinet, cello, and piano. But he meant to write it for oboe, bassoon, and piano. Because it actually sounds much better on oboe, bassoon, and piano. I've played it both ways, and there's something about the articulations of the instruments together, and especially the sort of more human plaintive quality of the bassoon. You'll hear that especially at the beginning of the second movement. It works a little better than that on the cello. So we're just helping Beethoven along here with this great, great piece. Beethoven had come to Vienna in 1792, hoping to study with Mozart. Unfortunately, Mozart dies in December of 1791, so those two great composers did not get to work together. But Beethoven did start studying with Franz Joseph Haydn, then the leading composer of the time, but they did not get along too well. Haydn wanted Beethoven to write more elegant music that was charming and really sort of the more classical style. Beethoven, already at the age of 22, knew what he wanted, and it was to write music from the soul, from the passion within, and sometimes that did not go well with what Haydn wanted, and that came to a front with Beethoven's Opus 1. There were three different piano trios that Beethoven decided would be his introduction to the Viennese public. The first two Haydn thought were fine, but the third one, the one in C minor, which I recently played, a very great early work, but Haydn suggested that Beethoven not publish that because he thought it was too advanced for the Viennese public and they might turn against him. Beethoven thought Haydn was just jealous that he had written this trio, so Beethoven went ahead and published it. On top of that, Haydn said, when you publish your Opus 1, could you put my name on it as your teacher? Because that was the usual thing that was done. And Beethoven said, no, I will not put your name on my music. So they sort of split apart soon after that. Beethoven studied for a little bit with Salieri, the composer you might recognize from Amadeus, the movie. Supposedly he poisoned Mozart, but we don't think that's true anymore. And then he studied with a guy named Altbrechtsberger, who is not very well known, except he did say one of the stupidest things of all time. After studying with Beethoven, teaching Beethoven just for a few weeks, he gave up, and he wrote to a friend, and he said, "This young Beethoven never has learned anything and never will learn anything. As a composer, he is completely hopeless." So he kind of missed the boat on that one. But when Beethoven first came, he was not known to Vienna. He was not known as a composer. He was known as a great, great pianist. And in fact, somebody who played the piano like nobody before had played. Whereas Mozart and Haydn were very good pianists. If you would watch them play, they really just barely moved their fingers. The pianos were smaller, they were more like harpsichords, and you didn't need a lot of weight to get the sound. But during this period, the pianos kept getting a little bigger, a little larger, and so when Beethoven came along, playing the piano for him was a full-body experience. There was shoulders and back, sometimes feet on the piano, and it was a sight to see. And in fact, Beethoven left behind a graveyard of pianos whenever he played, because he destroyed them. They were not able to keep up with that kind of power. And we have a great story as told by Anton Reicha, a friend of Beethoven's, who was asked to turn pages one day. He said, "During the evening, I was mostly occupied in wrenching the strings of the piano which had snapped, while the hammers stuck among the broken strings. Back and forth I leaped, jerking out a string, disentangling a hammer, turning a page. I think I worked harder than Beethoven." So it was a real sight to see. But not only could Beethoven play, and because of Beethoven really, our modern piano was born, because there was basically a competition amongst all the piano builders at the time to try to make the piano that Beethoven could not destroy. And in fact, John Broadwood in England sort of came up with the style that he couldn't really ruin. Then we got the cast iron plates in, and I think Beethoven would really have loved our more modern piano. But it's a fascinating thing to think of Beethoven and the development of our piano. But not only could Beethoven play with force and power, he could play with an expressiveness, a lyrical quality that, again, nobody had really heard. It was so connected, more like a song, so that people openly wept when Beethoven played some of his slow movements. They were just so beautiful. And he, in fact, said once, "Music should strike fire from the heart of man and bring tears from the eyes of women." And he really took it as a badge of honor whenever anybody was crying. So that's why Read 'em and Weep, actually, it goes well with this concert. He also said one of my favorite quotes. He said, "To play a wrong note is insignificant. To play without passion is inexcusable." And I think he always lived by that philosophy. Beethoven was fairly confident as a young man, one might say a little bit arrogant. He had a great quote that he wrote early in 1801. "Music is a higher revelation than all wisdom and philosophy. It is the wine which inspires one to new generative processes, and I am Bacchus, who presses out this glorious wine for mankind and makes them spiritually drunk." So he had a good sense of himself. And then the most famous story of that, he lived, when he first got to Vienna, with Prince Lichnowsky, who was a sort of enlightened nobleman, aristocrat, who had also been a patron of Mozart's. And Lichnowsky, this was right after the French Revolution, so things were changing already. Lichnowsky said to his servants, "If Beethoven rings the bell at the same time as I do, go to Beethoven first." So he understood the greatness of Beethoven. But in return for living at his home, Lichnowsky asked Beethoven to sometimes play at his many parties that he threw. And Beethoven did do that for some of them. But there was one famous occasion he refused to play at one of Lichnowsky's parties, and he left. And Lichnowsky wrote him a letter wondering where he had gone, and Beethoven wrote back this very famous reply. "Dear Prince Lichnowsky, what you are by accident of birth. What I am by myself. There are and will be 1,000 princes. There's only one Beethoven." So he knew pretty early on his greatness. This piece that we're going to play now, there's a wonderful story that goes along with it. It was premiered in 1798 at the home of Moritz von Fries. It had actually been a clarinetist named Joseph Beers who had suggested to Beethoven that he write a trio, and for one of the movements, in this case the last movement, the third movement, to use a theme that was being sung through the streets of Vienna. And that's why sometimes you see this trio is called the Gassenhauer Trio. That means street song. And it's based upon this very simple little ditty, this aria that comes from, it was an opera by Joseph Weigel called The Corsair, and it had a very silly little tune that was very simple to sing, and the words to this aria are very simple. It says, "Before I go to work, I must have something to eat." That's the whole aria. And Beethoven takes this tune and sort of deconstructs it and reconstructs it as only Beethoven can do in such wonderful ways. And you'll hear also at the end of that movement one of the longest trills ever written in music. It goes on for 30 measures. I think he's just showing off how long he can do a trill. But it really is a kind of genius moment in this piece. And when it was first premiered, there was, in the audience, was another pianist who had come over from Paris. His name was Daniel Steibelt. And this was a time in Vienna when there were things called piano duels, where pianists would challenge each other, not with swords, but to a kind of piano playoff to see who was the best pianist, who could improvise the best and show off. There had been a famous duel between Mozart and Clementi, and Beethoven had dueled with lots of different pianists. Steibelt heard this piece when it was premiered, and even though the piano part is challenging and good, it's not too over-the-top crazy. And so I think Steibelt thought, "Ooh, I can take on this Beethoven." So he challenged him to a duel. And a few days later, they would meet again at the Count Fries's house. And here's how it is described by one of Beethoven's friends. Steibelt first played a quintet, which had a good deal of success with the audience. He then played an improvisation, which had obviously been carefully prepared, choosing the same theme on which Beethoven had written his variations in his trio. This incensed the admirers of Beethoven and the great composer himself. When it was his turn to seat himself at the piano, he went up in his usual, I might say, ill-bred manner to the instrument, as if half pushed, picked up the cello part of Steibelt's quintet in passing, placed it intentionally upon the stand upside down, and with one finger drummed out the theme from the first few measures. Then, impelled by his insulted and excited feelings, he improvised in such a manner that Steibelt had to leave the room before he finished. Steibelt always stipulated that Beethoven could not be present at any party he went to. Beethoven really was the master improviser. He could sit down and take any tune and go with it. There's one last quote I want to give you, which is my favorite quote about Beethoven. It doesn't really apply to this piece. I think this is a piece that Haydn would have been very happy with. It is charming. It's really funny, actually. We don't think of Beethoven as funny, but he has a lot of humor in this, a lot of accents in weird places that sort of make you laugh a little bit, and that last movement is very funny in itself. But my favorite quote about Beethoven by Thomas Pynchon from the book Gravity's Rainbow, one of the characters in it says, "The point is, a person feels good listening to Rossini, but all you feel like listening to Beethoven is going out and invading Poland. That won't happen here. Here is the great Opus 11 by Beethoven.